Somewhere in your house, or your father's house, or a house you visited once as a boy, there was probably a rifle standing in a corner. Bolt action, walnut darkened by 60 years of hands, military marks stamped into the steel that nobody in the family could read. If it was British, it had a story. This is that story. Burma, the night of the 12th of May, 1945. A village called Taungda on the west bank of the Irrawaddy, where the river runs slow and brown and the jungle comes down to the water in a wall of green so dense that a man standing 10 feet away is a rumor rather than a shape. The war in Europe had ended 4 days earlier. Somewhere in London, people were still sweeping the streets clean of the paper they had thrown into the air. In Burma, it made no difference at all. In Taungda, it was raining, and it had been raining for hours, and a rifleman of the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, 27 years old, was lying in a forward trench on the extreme right of his company's position, listening to the sound of 200 Japanese soldiers moving toward him through the dark. His name was Lakhiman Gurung. He was 4 feet 11 inches tall. He had enlisted early in the war, and in the next few minutes, 3 grenades would come out of the blackness and land in the trench with him. He would throw the first one back. He would throw the second one back. The third would explode in his right hand. What that grenade did to him is recorded in the citation, and the citation is not a dramatic document. It is a flat administrative account written by men whose job was to describe things accurately. His right hand was destroyed. His fingers were gone. His right arm was broken. His face and his body and his right eye were torn by fragments. He was by any medical assessment then or now out of the fight. He was not out of the fight. What happened over the next 4 hours is the reason this video exists. But to understand what he did, you have to understand what was in his hands. A bolt-action rifle designed in the 19th century by a man who was born in a Scottish mill town and died in an American seaside village, and who never in his life saw a single one of the soldiers who would carry his work into battle. Because the rifle in Lakhiman Gurung's hands that night was, by the standards of 1945, obsolete. It was a design whose basic architecture had been fixed in 1888. It was manually operated at a time when the Americans had been issuing a semi-automatic rifle for 6 years. It used a cartridge with a rim on the base, an antique feature, a leftover from the black powder era, a thing that every other major military power had abandoned. Its locking lugs sat at the back of the bolt rather than the front, a configuration that engineers had already decided was inferior. On paper, in 1939, the Lee-Enfield should have been a liability. It was not a liability. It was, by the end of the Second World War, the widely distributed bolt-action service rifle in the history of the world. How that happened is a story about 2 men who never met each other, a government department that took both of their names and then took one of them away, and a country ran out of money at precisely the moment it could least afford to. Start in Scotland. Start in a valley. Howick sits in the Teviot Valley in Roxburghshire in the Scottish borders, a country of low green hills and fast water and stone bridges, where the wind comes down off the moors in the autumn and does not stop until March. In 1831, it was a mill town. Wool, knitwear, hosiery. The mills took water from the Teviot and the Slitrig and turned it into thread, and the thread into cloth, and the cloth into the modest, grinding, generational prosperity of a Borders manufacturing town. James Paris Lee was born there in 1831. His father was a watchmaker. Hold that detail, because everything that follows grows out of it. A watchmaker in 1831 is not a merchant who sells clocks. He is a man who makes and repairs mechanisms so small that the working surfaces cannot be seen properly by the naked eye. He works with escapements and hairsprings and pivots. He understands, in a way that almost nobody else in a Borders mill town understands, that the difference between a machine that functions and a machine that fails is very rarely the material it is made from. It is the fit. It is the clearance between one moving surface and another. It is the tolerance. It is the thousandth of an inch that decides whether a mechanism runs for 30 years or seizes in a week. A boy growing up at that bench does not learn precision as an idea. He learns it as a physical fact he can hold between his finger and his thumb. The family did not stay in Hawick. In the early 1830s, Lee was still a small child. They emigrated to Canada and settled in Ontario, in the country along the Upper St. Lawrence. It was a hard transplant, the kind of move that ended badly for a great many families in that decade. The Lees survived it. The father kept his trade. The son served an apprenticeship in it, and then the son did something that his father had not done. He became interested in guns. There is no dramatic origin here, no moment of revelation. What the record shows is a young man in his teens and 20s trained in fine mechanical work, teaching himself gunsmithing from the workbench up, taking things apart, understanding how they failed, and forming opinions about how they might fail less. By his mid-20s, he had crossed into the United States. In 1858, at the age of 27, he filed his first firearms patent. He had no institutional backing. He had no wealthy partner. He had no contract with any army in the world, and no realistic expectation of getting one. He was one of several hundred men across North America in that decade who believed they had a better idea about firearms, and the overwhelming majority of those men died in obscurity, with their patents unexploited and their workshops sold to pay their debts. Lee moved. Milwaukee, Janesville, Madison, Wisconsin towns, industrial towns, places where a man with mechanical skill could find work and, if he was disciplined, could keep a small shop going on the side. And through all of it, through the moves and the failed ventures and the years of no progress at all, he kept returning to one problem. Not the barrel, not the stock, not the sights, the magazine. To understand why Lee's obsession mattered, you have to understand what a 19th century soldier actually did when he fired his rifle. He raised it, he aimed, he fired, and then he lowered it, reached down to a pouch on his belt or his bandolier, found a single cartridge with his fingers, brought it up, opened the breech, inserted the cartridge, closed the breech, and raised the rifle again. Every one of those actions was a place where the sequence could break. In good conditions, on a range, in daylight, with dry hands and a full pouch, it worked. It worked well. Trained troops could sustain a respectable rate of fire indefinitely, but armies do not fight in good conditions. They fight at night. They fight in rain. They fight lying flat in mud, with their hands numb and their pouches full of grit and their fingers shaking with the specific chemical panic of being shot at. And in those conditions, the weakest point in the entire system, the whole apparatus of steel and walnut and gunpowder and years of manufacturing refinement, was a human hand reaching for a single small brass object in the dark. In 1879, Lee patented his answer, a spring-loaded box, detachable, holding cartridges in a staggered column, feeding them upward one at a time into the path of the bolt. The soldier did not handle individual cartridges. The soldier worked the bolt, and the rifle handed him the next round. Now, and this matters because a great deal of nonsense is spoken about this. Lee did not invent the magazine. The concept was not new in 1879. Repeating firearms existed. Tube magazines under the barrel existed and were in service. Various box-fed designs had been proposed and built and demonstrated. What Lee did was different and quieter and much harder. He made one that worked reliably enough and simply enough and cheaply enough that a national war office would take the risk of putting it into the hands of an entire army. That is not an act of invention. That is an act of engineering. And it is the reason the watchmaker's bench in Hawick matters. Because a magazine is a mechanism whose entire performance depends on tolerances. The spring rate, the clearance of the follower, the geometry of the feed lips, the angle at which a cartridge rises and presents itself to a bolt traveling forward at speed. Get any one of those wrong by a small enough margin to be invisible, and you have a box that jams. Lee got them right. In 1880, at Woolwich Arsenal on the Thames, the great artillery and ordnance establishment of the British Crown, his design went into trials. He was 49 years old. He had been working toward that room for 22 years. Now go somewhere else entirely. 280 miles southwest of Woolwich, in the county of Somerset, in the town of Taunton, A man named William Ellis Metford was working on a completely different problem in a completely different way for completely different reasons. Metford was born in 1824. He was a civil engineer by profession, a serious one, a railway engineer, a man who had worked in India on the East India Railway before his health broke and forced him home. And that is the first thing to understand about him. He was, for much of his working life, not well. The tropical illness he brought back from India shaped his career and eventually shortened it, so he worked from home. He worked at his own bench, on his own time, at his own expense, on a question that had fascinated him since the 1860s. Why do rifle barrels stop shooting straight? The answer, in the era of black powder, was fouling. Black powder is a filthy propellant. It does not burn cleanly. Every shot deposits a layer of carbon residue inside the barrel, and that residue builds up in the grooves of the rifling, the spiral cuts that spin the bullet and stabilize it in flight. After a dozen rounds, the grooves begin to fill. After 30, the accuracy has measurably degraded. After 100, a soldier in the field with no means of properly cleaning his weapon is carrying something closer to a smoothbore. Metford's response was to rethink the shape of the grooves themselves. Instead of the deep, sharp-cornered cuts that were standard, cuts with corners that trapped fouling and held it, he designed a system of shallow, rounded, gently swept grooves. 7 of them with no sharp internal corners anywhere for residue to lodge in. It was elegant work. It was patient work. It was the kind of work a man does over 20 years when he is too ill to go to an office and too intelligent to stop thinking. And when the British War Office tested it, it produced the most accurate service barrel then available anywhere. Metford had never met James Paris Lee. Lee had never heard of Metford. There was no partnership, no correspondence, no shared vision, no meeting of minds in a laboratory. There were 2 men on 2 continents solving 2 unrelated problems, entirely unaware of one another's existence. The War Office put them together. In 1888, the British Army adopted a new service rifle, Lee's bolt action and Lee's detachable 10-round magazine, married to Metford's barrel and Metford's rifling. They called it the magazine Lee Metford. It was manufactured at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock in Middlesex on the River Lea, a Crown establishment that had been making weapons for the British states since 1816. And here is the first thing that this story does that you will not expect. Neither man owned it, not Lee, not Metford, not any company, any consortium, any founder, any board. There was no Lee Metford Corporation. There were no shares. There was no dynasty built on the profits. The Crown owned the rifle. The Crown made it in Crown factories, proved it at Crown prof houses, issued it under Crown authority, and modified it whenever a Crown committee decided it should be modified, without needing the permission of either of the men whose ideas it was built from. That arrangement is the reason the Lee-Enfield exists in the numbers it exists in. No licensing fees, no royalty disputes. No corporate control of the tooling. When the Empire needed the rifle made in Calcutta and Lithgow and Toronto and Birmingham simultaneously, there was nobody to ask. It is also the reason for what happened next. 3 years, the magazine Lee Metford was the standard rifle of the British Army for 3 years before the ground moved underneath it. In 1891, the War Office adopted cordite. Cordite was a smokeless propellant, a member of the new generation of chemical explosives that were, in that decade, rendering every black powder firearm on Earth obsolete. It was more powerful. It produced far less smoke, which meant a rifleman firing from cover was no longer marking his own position with a white cloud after every shot. It burned cleaner, and it burned very much hotter. Metford's rifling had been designed with enormous care over 20 years to solve a problem created by black powder. Shallow grooves, rounded corners, a geometry optimized for a propellant that fouled heavily and burned relatively cool. Cordite did not foul heavily. Cordite ate the barrel. The higher combustion temperature attacked the shallow, delicate grooves that were Metford's whole contribution, and it attacked them fast. Barrels that should have lasted for thousands of rounds were being worn out of specification in a fraction of that. The most accurate rifling system in the world had been made worthless, not by a competitor, not by a better idea, but by a change in chemistry that had nothing to do with it. The Royal Small Arms Factory designed a replacement, deeper grooves, 5 instead of 7, cut in a left-hand twist, sharper, squarer, less refined, less clever, less elegant, and able to survive the heat. It was designed at Enfield. It carried the name of the place that made it. In 1895, the magazine Lee Metford became the magazine Lee-Enfield. William Ellis Metford's name came off the rifle. He was 71 years old. He had 4 years to live. He had spent 2 decades of a life shortened by illness solving one of the hardest problems in 19th century ballistics, and the solution had been so successful that it got the rifle adopted, and the adoption had brought a new propellant, and the new propellant had destroyed the solution. There is no record of him complaining about it. He died in 1899, and in that same year, 7,000 miles away, the rifle that no longer carried his name went to war for the first time and was found badly wanting. The Second Boer War began in October 1899. The British Army arrived in southern Africa, expecting a colonial campaign of the familiar type. A professional European force against irregular opposition, decided within months by discipline and artillery and numbers. What it met instead was something new. The Boer commandos were not a regular army. They had no uniforms, no drill, no formal command structure in the European sense. They were farmers and townsmen who could ride, who had grown up shooting for food, who knew the ground with the intimacy of people who had walked it since childhood, and who could not be brought to a decisive battle because they had no interest in fighting one. And they were armed with the Mauser. The Model 1895 Mauser, chambered for the 7x57mm cartridge, a smokeless round with a high velocity, a flat trajectory, and an effective range that comfortably exceeded what British troops were trained to engage at. Front-locking bolt, superb accuracy, excellent sights. At Colenso, at Magersfontein, at Spionkop, British infantry advanced across open ground toward positions they could not locate, because smokeless powder gave away nothing and were shot down at ranges they had not believed were survivable for the shooter. The lesson was brutal, expensive, and absolutely clear. Long-range fire mattered, concealment mattered. Individual marksmanship mattered far more than volley discipline. And the British rifle, whatever its virtues, was part of a system that had been outshot by a militia. The War Office response was the most important decision in the entire history of this weapon, and it was a decision that almost every other army in the world would have got wrong. They did not copy the Mauser. They shortened their own rifle instead. Here is the orthodoxy of 1900, and it was a genuine orthodoxy held by serious professionals in every major army. You need 2 rifles. You need a long rifle for the infantry, long barrel, long sight radius, maximum velocity, maximum accuracy, and a length that lets a man with a bayonet fixed reach an enemy horseman. And you need a short carbine for the cavalry and the artillery and the engineers, because a man on a horse or working a gun cannot manage a 5-foot weapon. 2 rifles, 2 production lines, 2 sets of spares, 2 training standards in 1903, and definitively in the pattern adopted in 1907, the British War Office abolished the distinction. 1 rifle for everybody. The short magazine Lee-Enfield, the SML, 44.5 inches overall, about 5 inches shorter than the rifle it replaced, just under 9 pounds unloaded. The reaction from foreign observers was close to contempt. It was, they said, a bad compromise. Too short to shoot well, too long to handle well, a weapon that did neither job properly in an attempt to do both cheaply. There were letters to the press. There were arguments in service journals. There was a widespread professional consensus that the British had made a serious error. They had not made an error. They had understood about 10 years before anyone else that the era of the aimed 1,000-yard infantry volley was ending, and that the war of the future would be fought at ranges where the handling of the weapon mattered more than the last 100 feet per second of muzzle velocity. And into that shorter, handier rifle, they built a set of features that would decide the next 40 years. This is the mechanical heart of the whole story. so we are going to be precise about it. The magazine, 10 rounds, double the capacity of the Mauser and of almost every other service rifle in the world, which held 5. Loaded from 2 5-round charger clips through a bridge machined into the receiver, so the whole 10 could be filled in 2 movements. The bolt, Lee's rear locking design. The lugs that hold the bolt shut against the pressure firing sit at the back of the bolt body rather than at the front. Every engineer of the period knew this was theoretically inferior. Locking at the front is stiffer. It puts less steel under stress. It gives, all else being equal, better accuracy. And the Mauser did it, and the Mauser was right. But locking at the rear allows a shorter bolt throw, less distance for the shooter's hand to travel, and less rotation to unlock. And it allows something else. Cock and closing. On a Mauser, the mainspring is compressed as the shooter lifts and pulls the bolt back, the hardest part of the stroke, the part where the hand is fighting the spring at the same time as breaking a fired case free of the chamber. On the Lee-Enfield, the mainspring is compressed on the forward stroke instead, as the bolt is pushed home and turned down. The heavy work happens where the shoulder and the body weight can help. Put those 3 together, 10 rounds, a short throw, and the effort placed where the hand is strongest, and you get the thing that made this rifle famous. Rate of aimed fire. The British Army's musketry standard, taught at the School of Musketry at Hythe in Kent, required a trained infantryman to place 15 aimed rounds into a target at 300 yards in 1 minute. 15 rounds. 60 seconds, every one of them aimed. That was not a record. That was the pass mark. Now, if you have watched other videos about this rifle, you have heard 2 stories, and I am going to deal with both of them honestly, because this channel would rather be accurate than exciting. The first is the mad minute record. You will hear that a sergeant instructor named Snoxall at Hythe in 1914 put 38 rounds into a 12-inch target at 300 yards in 60 seconds. 38. It is repeated everywhere. It is stated as fact in books, in articles, in 100 videos, and there is no solid contemporary source for it. The 15-round standard is documented. It is in the training manuals. It is a real, verifiable institutional requirement of the British Army. The 38-round record is a story that has been passed from secondary source to secondary source for a century, without anyone producing the original. It might be true. Extremely skilled men did extraordinary things with this rifle, but I am not going to tell you it is true, because I cannot show you where it comes from. The second is Mons. Late August 1914, at the Mons-Condé Canal in Belgium, the British Expeditionary Force of 4 infantry divisions, roughly 100,000 men, the entire professional standing army Britain could put in the field, met the advancing German First Army. The British fought a defensive action and inflicted casualties that startled the Germans. That is not in dispute. It is in the German records and the British records both. The famous claim is that German troops believed they were facing massed machine guns and were in fact facing rifles. And here is the honest position. Historians have been arguing about that claim for decades, and it is not settled. Some German accounts do describe an extraordinary volume of fire, but the BF also had machine guns, 2 per battalion, and they were used, and the idea that a whole army was fooled has the shape of a story that grew in the retelling on the British side rather than a conclusion drawn from German sources. I am telling you it is a legend because it is a legend, and I am telling you that because the truth underneath it is better. The truth is that Britain in 1914 possessed a small professional army, small enough that the Kaiser could be quoted, probably apocryphally, calling it contemptible, that had been trained to a standard of individual musketry that no conscript army on earth could match, using a rifle deliberately designed to reward exactly that training. They did not need to be mistaken for machine guns. They were the best shooting infantry in Europe, and within 4 months, most of them were dead. The original British Expeditionary Force was effectively destroyed by the end of 1914. Mons, Le Cateau, the Marne, the Ancre, and then the First Battle of Ypres. A series of engagements over 3 months that consumed the trained regular battalions of the British Army almost entirely. Those were the men who could do 15 aimed rounds a minute. That capability was not a piece of equipment. It was years of training in the bodies of specific individuals, and when those individuals were killed, it went with them. The volunteers of Kitchener's new army who replaced them were brave, willing, and in many cases, superbly motivated. They were not going 23 years at Hythe. They were going to be given a few weeks and a rifle and a train to the coast, which meant the rifle had to carry more of the load. And it meant Britain needed rifles in quantities that the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock could not produce no matter how many shifts it ran. What followed was one of the great industrial mobilizations of the age. BSA at Small Heath in Birmingham converted civilian capacity to rifle manufacture. The London Small Arms Company came into the chain. Contracts went to North America. The Dominion factories accelerated, Lithgow in New South Wales, and the Ishapur Rifle Factory on the Hooghly River in Bengal, which had been building Lee-Enfields under Crown license since 1905. And inside those factories, something happened that the official histories mention only in passing. The men who operated the capstan lathes and the milling machines enlisted. Skilled machinists, the most valuable industrial labor in the country, walked out of the works and into the recruiting offices in numbers that threatened production entirely. They were replaced by women. From 1915 onward, women were trained at Enfield and at Birmingham on machines they had never been permitted to touch before, producing components to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, on which the lives of the men in France directly depended. We do not know their names. The production records do not carry them. The wage books, where they survive, give initials and numbers. There is no monument at Enfield Lock listing the women who bored the barrels. They are, in the documentary record, a statistical category. But the rifles they made went to the proof house, and the proof house did not know or care who had made them, and they passed. They passed at exactly the same rate as the rifles made by the men they replaced. By 1918, the Lee-Enfield had been carried in Flanders, in Sinai, in Mesopotamia, in East Africa, and at Gallipoli. It had been issued to the infantry of Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and the West Indies. Millions had been built, and it had one persistent criticism, raised over and over by armorers and by musketry instructors: the sights. The SML used a rear sight mounted on the barrel, forward of the receiver, with a V-shaped notch. It was a 19th century arrangement. It put the rear sight far from the shooter's eye, which shortened the effective sight radius. And it used a notch rather than an aperture, which is measurably harder to align quickly and precisely. Every instructor knew it. Every armorer knew it. The answer was to move the rear sight backward, to the rear of the receiver, right up near the eye, and to make it an aperture. A small hole. The human eye centers itself in a circle automatically, without conscious effort. It is faster, and it is more accurate, and it was already understood to be better in 1918. Which brings us to the last and most important thing you need to know before the Second World War begins. Here is what almost every account of this rifle gets wrong. The standard version goes like this: Britain, sentimental and conservative, clung to its beloved Victorian rifle out of tradition, and was caught out in 1939, and only then scrambled to modernize. That is not what happened. The British Army knew. Development of an improved Lee-Enfield, the aperture rear sight, a heavier barrel, a receiver simplified for mass production, was underway through the 1920s and into the 1930s. Trial rifles existed. The design work was largely done. The rifle we now call the No. 4 was accepted at the end of 1939. It did not enter large-scale production until 1941. So what was the delay? It was not sentiment. It was not stupidity. It was not the generals loving the old rifle too much. It was money. Britain in the 1920s and 30s was a country carrying the debt of the First World War, operating under the assumption, formalized in policy, that no major war was expected for years ahead, and then hit by the Depression. Defense budgets were cut and cut again, re-equipping the entire infantry of the British Army and its dominions with a new rifle, and retooling every factory that made it was an enormous capital expense to solve a problem that was not, on paper, urgent. The existing rifle worked. There were millions of them. There were mountains of ammunition for them, so it was deferred. Reasonably, defensively, on the advice of people who were not fools. And here is the twist that reframes everything that follows in this story. The number 4 Mark I, when it finally arrived, was not primarily better at shooting. It was better at being manufactured. Every significant change in it, the simplified receiver, the barrel that protruded past the forend instead of being fully enclosed, the crude spike bayonet that replaced the elegant sword bayonet, the aperture sight that was easier to make as well as easier to use, pointed in the same direction. Fewer machining operations, less hand-fitting, less skilled labor per unit. It was a rifle designed for a country that expected to be at war, expected to lose factories to bombing, and expected to need weapons faster than it could train the craftsmen to build them. Britain did not fail to modernize in time. Britain modernized for a specific kind of war, an industrial war of survival and attrition, and got the shape of that war exactly right, which was fortunate, because September 1939, the British Army went into the Second World War carrying a rifle whose fundamental architecture was 44 years old, whose designer had been dead for 35 years, and whose co-designer's name had been erased from it before the 20th century even began. And within 9 months, that army would be standing on a beach in northern France, watching its equipment burn. May the 26th, 1940. The beaches at Dunkirk. If you have ever stood on the Channel coast in early summer, you know the light. Flat, wide. The kind of gray-white haze that makes the horizon disappear so that the sea and the sky become one continuous nothing, and a man looking out from the sand cannot tell where the water ends. 338,000 men came off those beaches over 9 days. British, French, Belgian. Off the mole at Dunkirk Harbor. Off the open sand at Bray Dunes and La Panne. Wading out chest-deep in their boots and their battle dress to reach the small boats that would ferry them to the destroyers, standing off in deeper water. And behind them on the sand, they left the British Army's equipment, not some of it, almost all of it. The figures are in the official record, and they are worth hearing slowly, because they are the reason everything else in this story happened the way it did. Around 64,000 vehicles. More than 2,400 guns, the field artillery, the anti-tank guns, the anti-aircraft guns of an entire expeditionary force. Something in the order of 20,000 motorcycles, 500,000 tons of stores and ammunition, and rifles, hundreds of thousands of rifles. Because a man wading out to a boat with the water at his chest cannot swim carrying a rifle, and the order in many units was to throw the bolt one way and the weapon another so the Germans could not use it. Men stood in the shallows and disassembled their rifles and dropped the pieces into the channel. Some stacked them on the sand in neat piles, the way they had been taught, because that is what you do with a rifle, even when you are abandoning it. Some men would not let go of them at all, and were pulled aboard, still holding them, and those rifles came home. Not enough of them came home. The exact number of rifles lost has never been firmly established. What is established is what happened next, because within weeks there were not enough rifles in Britain to arm the men standing in village halls waiting for one. And Britain had lost them at the exact moment when the possibility of German troops coming ashore in Kent had stopped being an abstraction. On the 14th of May, 1940, while the retreat to the coast was still in progress, the Secretary of State for War, Anthony Eden, broadcast on the BBC and called for volunteers. Men between 17 and 65, not already in military service, to enroll in a new force, the Local Defense Volunteers. Within weeks it would be renamed, at Churchill's insistence, the Home Guard. The response was overwhelming. 250,000 men put their names down inside the first week. By the end of June, it was well over 1 million. Farmers, bank clerks, miners, schoolmasters, men in their 50s and 60s who had been in the trenches in the last war and had assumed they were finished with all that, stand in village halls and church halls across England, Scotland, and Wales, waiting to be issued a weapon. There were no weapons. This is the part of the story that the comfortable version leaves out. You have heard it said, I have heard it said, that Britain simply replaced everything lost at Dunkirk within a couple of months, that the factories rose to it and the crisis passed. That is not true. The truth is harder, and it is more impressive, because it involves admitting how close the thing came to the edge. In the summer of 1940, the British Army had priority for every rifle in the country, and there was not enough for the Army. The Home Guard, in its first months, drilled with shotguns, with sporting rifles taken from private owners, with pikes. And yes, that is real, a genuine order for long steel spikes to be mounted on tubes, an idea so humiliating that it was raised in Parliament. With clubs, with nothing. What saved them came across the Atlantic. The United States released large quantities of surplus rifles from its First World War stockpiles, model of 1917 Enfields and Springfields, weapons that had been packed in Greece in American depots for 20 years. They came over in cargo ships through the U-boat lines. They were unpacked, degreased by hand in British depots, and issued. But they were not chambered for the British cartridge. The American rifles fired the .30-06. The British rifles fired the .303. The cartridges are close enough in size that a frightened man in the dark could try to force the wrong one into the wrong weapon, and the consequences of that, in a rifle, are not a jam. They are a rifle coming apart in a man's hands, so the American rifles were marked, a broad red band painted around the forend of the stock. Think about what that band actually meant. It meant that in the summer of 1940, the British Isles were defended in part by 60-year-old men carrying 20-year-old American rifles that had to be painted so they would not kill the men holding them. That is the real condition of the country at that moment, not the poster, not the speech. A stripe of red paint on a piece of walnut. And now the design work of the 1930s, the work that had been deferred for want of money, stopped being a low-priority procurement question and became the thing that everything depended on. The rifle number 4, Mark I, accepted at the end of 1939, into serious mass production from 1941. Look at one next to an old SMLE, and the differences seem cosmetic. The barrel sticks out past the woodwork at the muzzle instead of being fully shrouded. The rear sight has moved back to the receiver and become an aperture. The bayonet is no longer a beautiful 17-inch sword blade, but a plain steel spike that the soldiers immediately christened the pig sticker. None of that is cosmetic. All of it is the same decision made over and over. Fewer man-hours, less skill, faster. The full-length wooden forend of the SMLE was a piece of craftsmanship. It required careful fitting to the barrel by a man who had served an apprenticeship. Cut it short and let the barrel protrude, and you have removed hours of skilled hand labor from every rifle in the country's production. The sword bayonet was a forging with a fuller, a ground edge, a shaped grip, and a finished scabbard. The spike bayonet was a steel rod with a point on it. It was ugly. Soldiers hated it. It could not be used as a knife, could not cut rope, could not open a tin. But it took a fraction of the time to make. And in 1941, time was the only currency Britain had. Every one of those changes removed skilled handwork from the process. Not to save money, to save the one thing Britain could not buy, borrow, or be lent: time. And it was, into the bargain, genuinely more accurate because the receiver was heavier and stiffer and the sight radius was longer. That was a bonus. That was not the point. The point was that a country expecting its factories to be bombed had designed a rifle that'd be built by workers it had not yet trained, in buildings it had not yet built, out of a machine shop that might be operating in a shed by the end of the month. Where did they build them? Royal Ordnance Factory Fazakerley on the northern edge of Liverpool, Royal Ordnance Factory Maltby in South Yorkshire in the coalfield country, BSA at Shirley outside Birmingham, and these were not old established gunworks staffed by generations of gunsmiths. Fazakerley and Maltby were new. Purpose-built shadow factories, put up as part of a deliberate policy of dispersing armaments production away from the traditional centers that the Luftwaffe knew how to find. The workforce was drawn from whoever was left, which meant overwhelmingly women, By 1943, conscription of women into industry in Britain had gone further than in any other combatant nation on either side. Unmarried women aged 20 to 30 were called up. Married women volunteered in enormous numbers. The Ministry of Labor directed them, and a great many of them were directed into the ordnance factories. Picture the floor at Fazakerley.
No, the noise.
And I mean noise of a kind you cannot really imagine unless you have stood in a machine shop running at full production. Hundreds of machines, belt drives overhead, metal on metal, continuously for an 8 or 10 or 12-hour shift. The smell of cutting oil, which gets into cloth and hair and does not wash out. The light, because the windows are blacked out, so it is electric light all day, in every season. And a woman finishing a night shift walks out into a blackout and goes home in the dark, having not seen the sun. And the work itself, repetitive, exacting, and unforgiving. A barrel bored and rifled to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A bolt body machine so that its locking lugs bear evenly. A receiver, a magazine, an extractor spring. Do it wrong and it fails inspection. Do it wrong and away inspections misses, and a man in Normandy works his bolt and nothing happens. They knew that. That was understood on the factory floor. It was the thing that made the shifts bearable. Their names are not recorded. Not in any meaningful way. The production records account for output, not for people. There is no roll of honor at Fazakerley. There is no list. Some of them gave interviews decades later as old women, and those interviews exist and are precious and are a tiny fraction of the whole. 2, 3, 400,000 rifles came out of those factories, and the women who made them are a statistic. I want you to hold that thought for a moment, because it is going to matter at the end of this story. And now the twist that most people who love this rifle have never fully absorbed. Britain could not make enough of them. Even with Fazakerley, even with Maltby, even with BSA running flat out.
So the number 4 Mark I was made in Canada at the Small Arms Limited plant at Long Branch, Ontario, on the shore of Lake Ontario west of Toronto.
And it was made in the United States, at the Savage Arms plant in Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. Sit with that. The rifle we are calling Britain's greatest military rifle, the weapon that armed the empire, that fought at El Alamein and Kohima and in Normandy, was at the moment of Britain's greatest coming off American production lines in New England, under Lend-Lease built by American workers who would never see the men who carried them. The rifle Savage made carry a marking on the receiver, U.S. property, because under Lend-Lease, legally, that is what they were. Not sold, not given, lent. The property of the United States government, placed in the hands of an ally that could not otherwise arm itself. There is a mark on the metal that tells you the whole strategic situation of 1941 in 2 words. There is a second detail, and collectors will know it instantly. The North American factories introduced a simplified method of releasing the bolt from the rifle, a machined slot, rather than the more complex catch used on British production. Rifles with that change are stamped number 4 Mark I star, the star. It is a tiny mark a few millimeters across, and it means this rifle was made in North America on a line that was set up to build weapons faster than the design originally allowed for a war that could not wait for elegance. An old rifle in a rack in a museum in Ottawa or Massachusetts or Yorkshire, and stamped into the metal is the entire industrial history of the Alliance. Now take that rifle out of the factory and put it in the sand. North Africa, 1940 to 1942. The Western Desert, a landscape of gravel, plain, and salt marsh and soft sand, where the wind picks up abrasive dust and carries it into everything with a moving part, and where the temperature at midday can strip a man of 2 liters of water an hour, and then drop hard enough at night that he cannot sleep for shivering. The 8th Army fought there for 2 years. Advance and retreat along the same coast road, Sidi Barrani, Tobruk, besieged for 241 days. Gazala, the retreat to a railway halt in Egypt that almost nobody had heard of, called El Alamein. And this is where the rifle that every engineer had called inferior stopped losing the argument. The Lee-Enfield was not a tightly fitted rifle. It had clearance in it, a bolt handle positioned where a man's palm could strike it hard, and a cock-on closing action that let him drive the stroke with his shoulder behind it. Exactly why it tolerated sand as well as it did is still argued about by people who know more about it than I do. That it did is not argued about at all. It was filthy, and it kept working. Then the second desert lesson, and it is a mechanical one that killed men. The 303 British cartridge has a rim, a projecting lip around the base of the case. It is an antique feature. The Germans, the Americans, everyone modern had gone to rimless cartridges by then. If you load a Lee-Enfield magazine carelessly, and one cartridge rim ends up behind the rim of the one beneath it, the top round cannot travel forward. It catches, the bolt jams, and you are lying in a slit trench with a rifle that is stopped. They called it rim lock. The answer was training, a drilled, repeated physical habit of loading so that every rim sat forward of the one below it. Do it 1,000 times on a parade ground until your hands do it in the dark without your brain. That is what those months of drill were actually for. Not for show, so that a 19-year-old with his ears ringing and his mouth full of dust would load the magazine correctly without thinking about it. The men who did not learn it properly found out at El Alamein. The battle opened on the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, with a barrage from over 800 guns. 12 days later, the Axis line broke, and Rommel began the retreat that would not stop Tunisia. Churchill said afterwards that before Alamein, Britain had never won a victory, and after it had never suffered a defeat. It is a good line, and it is roughly true, and the infantry who walked through those minefields did it with rifles designed in the 19th century. Somewhere in the middle of all this, in the ordinary flow of production at Fazakerley and Maltby and BSA, inspectors were doing something that has no equivalent in modern manufacturing. They were watching for exceptional rifles. Every production line produces variation. Most rifles are within specification. A few by chance, the barrel a little truer, the bedding a little better, the tolerances stacking favorably instead of unfavorably, shoot noticeably better than the rest. Those rifles were pulled off the line. They were crated and sent to London, specifically in large part to Holland and Holland, one of the great English sporting gun makers, a firm that had spent a century building bespoke rifles for men who shot in Africa and India, and whose entire craft workforce had been turned over to war work. There by hand, the selected rifle was converted. Wooden pads were fixed to the side of the receiver, glued and screwed, to carry a mounting bracket. A telescope was fitted. The sight, telescope number 30, 3 power. A heavy brass and steel instrument built to survive being dropped. A wooden cheek rest was added to the butt, raising the shooter's eye to the height of the scope, and then it was zeroed. Individually, that rifle with that scope on that mount shot by a craftsman on a range until it grouped where it was pointed. The scope was numbered to the rifle. The rifle was numbered to the scope. They were issued together in a wooden transit chest, and if they were ever separated, the accuracy that had been built into that specific pairing by hand was gone. The result was the rifle number 4, Mark I, T for telescopic. Something in the order of 25,000 were made across the whole war. Out of millions of rifles, the men who carried them were selected too, and the selection was not primarily about shooting. Marksmanship was assumed. What the sniper training schools were looking for was temperament, patience, self-discipline, the ability to lie still in one position for many hours and to observe and to remember and to report. Because most of a sniper's work was not shooting, it was watching a sniper pair, a shooter, and an observer with a telescope inserted into no man's land before dawn and lying in the same place until after dark, producing an intelligence log of everything that moved. They were also uniquely among infantrymen, killing people they could see clearly. An infantry section attacking a hedgerow is firing at movement and muzzle flash and shapes. A sniper at 400 yards through that telescope is looking at a man's face. He can see him eating. He can see him laughing at something. He can see him unbuttoning his tunic in the sun. And then he shoots him. The men who did that job came home and, in very large numbers, did not talk about it. Not to their wives, not to their sons. Some of them talked when they were in their 70s and 80s to historians and to their grandchildren. And what comes through those accounts again and again is not guilt exactly, and not pride either. It is the clarity of the memory. 50 years on, they could describe the face. That is what the selected rifle bought. Precision, at a price paid by the man holding it over the rest of his life. This channel would rather be accurate than exciting, so here is the failure. By 1943, the Lee-Enfield had a problem that the desert had not exposed, but the jungle would. Burma. The war against Japan in Southeast Asia, fought by the 14th Army, the largest army in the Commonwealth, over 1 million men at its peak, British and Indian and African and Gurkha, in country that was not so much terrain as an obstacle. Primary jungle, hill ranges running north to south across every line of advance, and a monsoon that dropped several hundred inches of rain in a season. In that environment, engagement ranges collapsed. A rifleman was not shooting at 400 yards. He was shooting at 40, sometimes at 10, sometimes at the length of a room. And he was carrying his rifle up mountains day after day on rations that were never enough. A 44.5-inch rifle is a burden on a jungle track and a liability in a contact at 10 yards. So Britain built a shorter one. The rifle number 5, Mark I, adopted in 1944, barrel cut down by 5 inches, wood lightened, metal lightened, holes machined out of the receiver where strength was not needed. About 2 pounds lighter overall. A conical flash hider on the muzzle, because the shortened barrel produced a fireball that would blind a man at night and mark his position for 100 yards. A rubber pad on the butt to soften the recoil. It looked superb. It handled beautifully. Soldiers who used it in Burma generally liked it. It has a name that everybody knows even now, the jungle carbine, and it did not work. Rifles came back from the field with reports that they would not hold their zero. A weapon sighted in one day would be shooting somewhere else the next. Not wildly, but enough. Enough that a man could not trust it. The armorers investigated. They re-zeroed. They checked bedding, checked screws, checked scopes and sights. The rifles held for a while and then drifted again. The phenomenon got a name that has stuck ever since, the Wandering Zero. And here is the honest position, because the internet is full of confident explanations, and the confident explanations disagree. The lightning cuts in the receiver have been blamed. The shortened barrel has been blamed. Some ordnance investigators concluded there was an inherent fault in the design. Others could not reproduce it consistently. The debate is not settled today. What is settled is what the British Army did about it. In 1947, having been unable to cure it, they declared the number 5 obsolete 3 years. That is the entire service life of the shortened Lee-Enfield as a standard weapon. The last significant redesign of the most successful bolt-action rifle in history was a failure, and the institution that produced it looked at the evidence and admitted so and stopped making it. There is something worth respecting in that. It is very easy for an army or a company or a country to keep defending a thing it has already committed to. Britain in 1947 was exhausted, bankrupt, and had every incentive to declare the problem solved and move on. They wrote it off instead. Which brings us to the thing that has been building underneath this entire second act, and which needs saying plainly before we go to Burma. Call it Britain's greatest military rifle, and you have to be honest about what the word Britain is doing in that sentence. By 1944, the Lee-Enfield was being manufactured in England, in Canada, in the United States, in Australia at Lithgow in New South Wales, and in India at Ishapur on the Hooghly River in Bengal, a factory that had been building this rifle under license since 1905. And it was being carried in the field by men from every part of the world the empire had reached. The 14th Army in Burma, the army that fought the longest and hardest campaign of the British War and got so little attention at home that it called itself the Forgotten Army, was majority Indian. Divisions of the Indian Army, battalions of Gurkhas, recruited from the hills of Nepal, a country that was not even part of the empire. West African and East African formations, British battalions alongside them. At El Alamein, there were Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Indians, Greeks, and Free French in the line. In Italy and in Northwest Europe, there were Canadians in enormous numbers, and Poles who had walked out of the Soviet Union to get there. Every one of them carrying a rifle designed by a Scotsman who emigrated to Canada as a child and did his life's work in the American Midwest with a barrel designed by an invalid engineer in Somerset whose name had been taken off it in 1895. If the Lee-Enfield is Britain's greatest military rifle, then Britain, in this sentence, is not an island. It is a quarter of the surface of the earth, and most of the men who died holding this weapon were not born within 1,000 miles of the River Lea. The rain came in Burma in the middle of 1944, and it came in Burma again in 1945, and in between those two monsoons, the Japanese 15th Army made the decision that would destroy it. In March 1944, 3 Japanese divisions crossed the Chindwin River and marched west into India. Operation Yugo. The objective was Imphal and the road that ran north from it to a hill station called Kohima, and beyond that, the plains of Bengal. They carried 3 weeks of rations. The plan depended on capturing British supply dumps. It was not a supply plan. It was a bet. At Kohima, in April, the bet came due. The fighting there concentrated at its worst around the bungalow of the deputy commissioner of the Naga Hills and the terraced garden behind it, where the British administration had built a tennis court. A tennis court is 78 feet long. For 2 weeks, the front line ran across it. British and Indian troops on one side of the court, Japanese troops on the other, close enough to throw grenades by hand, close enough to hear each other, close enough that neither side could use artillery without killing its own men. There is no maneuver at that range, no air support. Armor, and a man with a rifle, and a man with a rifle, and 78 feet. Kohima and Imphal broke the Japanese 15th Army. Of the roughly 85,000 men who marched into India, more than half never came out. Most of them did not die in battle. They starved, and they died of disease on the retreat back to the Chindwin through the mountains in the rain, and the track they used got a name from the men who walked it. The Road of Bones, Tangda. The night of the 12th of May, 1945. He was in the forward trench with 2 other men. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing most retellings leave out because it complicates the shape of a hero story. Lakhaman Gurung was not standing alone by choice. There were 3 men in that position, and it was the most exposed position his company held, and the 2 men with him were wounded badly enough in the opening minutes that neither could fight. So he was not alone at the start. He was alone by about 1:30 in the morning. The attack came in the dark. Around 200 Japanese soldiers moving against a company position, and the forward trench, his trench, was the first thing they came to. The grenades came out of the blackness. The first one landed in the trench beside him. He picked it up and threw it back, and it exploded outside. The second one landed in the trench. He picked it up and threw it back, and it exploded outside. Think about what that requires. Not courage in the abstract. A specific physical decision made twice, in under a few seconds each time, in total darkness, by a man who has to locate a small hot metal object by feel in a hole in the ground, while men who are trying to kill him are moving toward him through the trees. The third grenade landed in the trench, and he reached for it, and it went off in his right hand. The citation, which is a British Army administrative document and does not use adjectives, records what it did. His right hand was shattered. His fingers were gone, his right arm was broken, his face, his body, and his right leg were severely wounded. His right eye was blinded. He was 27 years old, and this was the last month of the war. What he did next is the reason we are here. He propped his rifle on the parapet of the trench with his left hand. Understand the mechanical problem. A Lee-Enfield is a manually operated weapon. To fire it more than once, you must lift the bolt handle, draw it back, push it forward, and turn it down. That is a 2-handed operation performed by every soldier who ever carried one. Support hand on the forend, firing hand on the bolt. He had one hand. So he braced the rifle against the earth and he worked the bolt with his left hand and he reached forward and pulled the trigger with the same hand and he loaded and he fired and he loaded and he fired for 4 hours. The Japanese came at that trench repeatedly through the night. Each time they came from a position on the extreme right of the line, alone, with one eye, one hand, and a broken arm. A man kept shooting. And here is a detail that comes not from the citation, but from accounts given afterwards by the men in the positions behind him. He was shouting, not orders. He had nobody to give orders to. He was calling out in Nepali that he was still there, that the Gurkhas were still there, calling it out into the dark between attacks so that the men behind him would know the right flank had not gone, and so that the men in front of him would know exactly what they were still walking toward. When it got light, the position had held. Accounts differ on how many attackers were killed in front of that trench. The citation gives no number. It gives only the 4 hours. He survived. He lost the eye and the hand permanently. He was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest decoration for valor in the face of the enemy that the British Crown can give. And the award was published in the London Gazette, and the citation is a matter of public record that anyone can read today. Laman Gurung went home to Nepal to a hill village and farmed with one hand. He came to Britain in 2008, an old man in his 90s, to a Yargum pub for the right of Gurkha veterans to settle in the country they had fought for. He stood in front of cameras with his empty right sleeve and his blind eye and made that argument, and the campaign won. He died in 2010, aged 92, 10 weeks before Taungda on the 5th of March 1945, at a hilltop position the British had named Snowdon Isidis. A rifleman of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, did something equally documented and almost never told. His name was Banbagta Gurung. His section was pinned in the open by a sniper firing from a tree. Men were being hit and there was no cover. He stood up. He stood up in full view, in the open, under fire, and shot the sniper out of the tree with his rifle, because from a prone position he could not get the angle. Then his section came under fire from a series of Japanese foxholes on the crest above them, and he cleared them, one after another, alone, grenades and bayonet. 2 foxholes, then a 3rd, then a 4th, then a bunker at the top of the hill opened up with a machine gun. He went up to it, climbed onto the roof, and dropped grenades through the firing slit. When 2 Japanese soldiers came out of it, he killed them with his kukri, the curved Nepalese knife that every Gurkha carries. Then he went inside the bunker and held it, and called his section forward to occupy the position. Victoria Cross. Published in the Gazette, a matter of record. Banbagta Gurung also went home to a Nepalese village. He left the army in the late 1940s to care for his mother, his widowed sister, and her children. He lived quietly in Nepal for another 60 years and died there in 2008, 2 men. 2 farms in the hills of a country that was never part of the British Empire. 2 of the highest awards for courage that Britain has ever issued. And the instrument in both their hands on both those days was a bolt-action rifle whose designer had died in Connecticut in 1904. We should be exact here because the point of this entire story is not that a piece of steel was magic. The rifle did not hold that trench at Taungda. Lakhiman Gurung held it, but the rifle let him. Consider what he would have had in his hands on the same night in the same trench if he had been in a different army. A Mauser Kar 98K, the standard German rifle. 5 rounds instead of 10, and a bolt that must be lifted through a longer arc against the resistance of the mainspring. A stroke that is meaningfully harder to perform one-handed with a rifle braced against dirt. An M1 Garand, the American rifle, and by any technical measure the best infantry rifle of the war. Semi-automatic, 8 rounds, no bolt to work at all. In many ways easier. But when the 8th round goes, the empty clip is ejected and the bolt locks back. Reloading means pressing a fresh 8-round clip down into the receiver with the thumb while holding the operating rod back with the same hand, a movement that is awkward enough with 2 hands, and that many of you watching have taken a bruised thumb from. With one hand in the dark, with a broken arm repeatedly, over 4 hours, it is very hard to see how it gets done at all. The Lee-Enfield gave him 10 rounds before he had to think about the magazine at all. It gave him a bolt throw short enough and a cocking stroke placed where a single arm could drive it. It gave him a rifle that was filthy and wet and had been dragged through Burma and still cycled. That is not romance. That is a chain of design decisions running from 1879 to 1939, arriving in a hole in the ground on the Irrawaddy 66 years after the first of them, and being exactly enough. The war ended in August 1945, and Britain, which had just fought and survived the largest conflict in human history with a rifle designed in the 19th century, sat down to build its replacement. What happened next is the twist in this story that almost nobody outside a narrow world of enthusiasts knows. And it is the reason the Lee-Enfield's ending is not a story about a rifle wearing out. It is a story about a country losing an argument. In 1945 and 46, British ordnance researchers went through the accumulated combat data of 6 years of war. The reports, the wound statistics, the range at which infantry engagements had actually taken place. And they found what the Germans had independently found, that the full-power rifle cartridge was a solution to a problem that no longer existed. The .303 British and the German .792 Mauser and the American .30-06 were all designed in an era that expected infantry to engage at 800, 1,000, 1,200 yards. That was the doctrine of 1890. Actual infantry combat in the Second World War happened almost entirely inside 400 yards, overwhelmingly inside 300, which meant every soldier on Earth was carrying a cartridge roughly twice as powerful as he needed with recoil he could not control in automatic fire, and heavy enough that he could carry far less of it. The British answer was a cartridge called the .280 British, 7 millimeters, intermediate power, sized for the war that actually happens rather than the war of 1900. And around it, at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, the same site on the River Lea that had made every Lee-Enfield since 1895, a design team built a rifle. The team was led by a man named Stefan Kenneth Jansen. He was Polish. He had come to Britain as a refugee, an ordnance engineer who had escaped the destruction of his own country in 1939, and he had anglicized his name. He worked at Enfield through the war and after it, and the rifle he and his team produced was called the EM2. It was a bullpup. The magazine and the action sat behind the trigger inside the shoulder stock, which meant you could have a full-length barrel and a weapon a foot shorter than a Lee-Enfield. It had an optical sight as standard issue in 1950, when every other army was still issuing iron sights to infantrymen. It fired semi-automatic or fully automatic. It was in the trials conducted at Enfield in 1950 and 1951 better than everything it was tested against. Better than the American designs that would eventually become the M14. Better than the early Belgian FN rifle. The British Army evaluated it, compared it to the alternatives, and recommended adoption. In 1951, under the Attlee government, the EM2 was formally accepted as the Rifle Automatic No. 9 Mark I. The British Army had, on paper, adopted the most advanced infantry rifle in the world, a bullpup with an optical sight and an intermediate cartridge, a configuration that the rest of the planet would spend the next 30 to 40 years arriving at. And then it was canceled. Here is why. NATO had been founded in 1949, the organizing principle of the alliance, in an era when everyone expected Soviet armored formations to come west through Germany at any moment, was standardization. If the British and the Americans and the Belgians and the Canadians were going to fight the same war on the same ground, they needed to be able to hand each other ammunition. One rifle cartridge for the alliance. Britain proposed the .280. The United States said no. The American position, argued hardest by the Army Ordnance Establishment and personally by Colonel Rene Studler, who ran U.S. small arms development, was that the intermediate cartridge was underpowered. American doctrine still valued long-range rifle performance. American testing standards demanded penetration and retained energy at ranges the British data said no longer mattered. And there was undeniably an institutional preference for a cartridge that resembled the .30-06 the U.S. Army already knew. The Americans wanted a full all-power round, the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO. There was no realistic way for Britain to win that argument. In 1951, Winston Churchill returned to office. In 1952, the government confirmed the decision. Britain would abandon the .280 cartridge and adopt the American 7.62 as the NATO standard. The EM2 had been designed around the .280. It could not simply be rechambered. The whole architecture was built for that round. There were attempts. They did not work well. The rifle was dead. Stefan Jansen's team was dispersed. The prototypes went into the pattern room collection. The most advanced infantry rifle in the world was put on a shelf, and the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock, 135 years of continuous crown manufacture, the works that had built the pattern 1853 Enfield, and the Martini Henry and the Lee Metford, and every mark of Lee-Enfield through 2 world wars, was directed to produce, under license, a Belgian design. The FN FAL, built at Enfield as the L1A1 self-loading rifle. On the 16th of April 1957, the Lee-Enfield was formally declared obsolete as the standard rifle of the British Army. It had not been beaten by a better weapon. It had been retired in the course of a political elopement that Britain lost in favor of a foreign design. Because the Ally factories had kept Britain armed in 1941, had also acquired upon the power to decide what everybody's ammunition would look like. That is what the end of this rifle actually is. Not obsolescence, a change in who got to make the decision. And yet, declaring something obsolete does not stop it working. The sniper rifle, the one job the Lee-Enfield kept, was the job it had always done best. The action of a number 4, rebarreled for the new 7.62 NATO cartridge, fitted with a modern telescopic sight, became the L42A1, introduced in the early 1970s. It stayed in British service as the Army's sniper rifle until replacement began in the mid-1980s, and it remained in use into the early 1990s, which means British soldiers went to the Falklands in 1982 and served in Northern Ireland into the 1980s, carrying an action that James Paris Lee had patented before the invention of the light bulb was widespread. India. The Ishapur Rifle Factory in Bengal did not stop when the British left in 1947. It had kept building Lee-Enfields for the Indian Army, and in the 1960s produced the Ishapur 2A, a Lee-Enfield built with modern steel and chambered for 7.62 NATO. India's soldiers carried Lee-Enfield rifles in frontline service for decades after independence, and Indian police and paramilitary formations carried them for decades after that. Canada. The Canadian Rangers, the part-time patrol force of the Canadian Forces, drawn largely from Inuit and First Nations and Métis communities across the Arctic, were issued the Lee-Enfield No. 4 when the unit was formed in 1947. They kept it through the Cold War, through the space age, into the 21st century. Men patrolling the sea ice north of the tree line in temperatures where lubricants freeze solid and any weapon with a gas system or tight tolerances is a liability carried a rifle whose basic design predated powered flight, and carried it because in that environment nothing had convincingly been shown to be better. The decision to replace them was taken in 2015, and the new rifles began reaching Ranger patrols from 2018, and the reason for the change was not that the Lee-Enfield had failed. It was ammunition. 303 British had been out of general military production for decades, and sourcing enough of it to train patrols in the Arctic had become impractical. The rifle outlasted its own cartridge by more than half a century. The Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield Lock was privatized in 1984 and sold to British Aerospace. Small arms production on the site ended in 1988, 172 years. The buildings did not come down. Several of the Victorian structures were given listed status, which in Britain means legally protected from demolition. The site was redeveloped into housing. It is called Enfield Island Village. There are family homes there now and a heritage trail and information boards. You can walk along the River Lea past the buildings where the barrels were bored. The machines were auctioned. The men and women who had operated them retired, and the apprenticeship schemes that would have carried what they knew into another generation had been wound down years before the factory itself closed. There is no document that records what those people had in their hands and their eyes, the accumulated judgment of a working lifetime about how a barrel sounds when the tool is cutting right. That knowledge did not get written down. It just stopped. Let us close the circle on the people, because this was never really a story about steel. James Paris Lee, born Hawick, Scotland, 1831, watchmaker's son, immigrant to Canada as a child, self-taught gunsmith, a man who spent 22 years working toward a room at Woolwich Arsenal, died at Short Beach, Connecticut in 1904. He was 73. He never saw the First World War. He never saw a single one of the millions of soldiers who would carry his magazine and his bolt. He never saw Mons or Gallipoli or Alamein or Kohima or Tangda. He had no idea. He had made a box that fed cartridges into a rifle without a man having to touch them, and he died a private citizen in a Connecticut seaside town, and the thing he made outlived him by 114 years of frontline military service. William Ellis Metford, born 1824, civil engineer, invalided home from India, a man who solved one of the hardest problems in 19th century ballistics from his own house because he was too ill to work anywhere else, died in 1899. He did not live to see the Boer War his rifling had been intended for. He did not live to see what the thing he helped build would become. Stefan Kenneth Jansen, Polish refugee, ordnance engineer, leader of the EM2 team, built the best infantry rifle in the world in 1951 and watched it canceled by a decision made across the Atlantic about the diameter of a piece of brass. The women of Fazakerley and Maltby and Enfield, tens of thousands of them, working blacked-out shifts in the noise and the cutting oil, holding tolerances of thousandths of an inch on components that a man in Normandy would stake his life on, are not named anywhere. Lahiman Gurung and Banbagta Gurung went back to the hills of Nepal and farmed. Not one of these people owned any part of this. There was no company. There were no shares. Nobody got rich. The Crown owned the rifle. The Crown made it. And when the Crown was finished with it, the Crown sold the factory and the machines went to auction. We opened this by putting a word in the title, and it's time to answer for it. Was the Lee-Enfield the best rifle of the Second World War? No. I want to be completely straight with you about that, because you have stayed with me this long, and you are owed the honest conclusion rather than the flattering one. The M1 Garand was a better infantry rifle. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, no bolt to work. A man could put aimed fire downrange faster than any bolt-action shooter on Earth without moving anything but his trigger finger. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and while Patton was not a man given to understatement on this, he was essentially right. If you were choosing a rifle to hand to an infantryman in 1944 on pure fighting merit, you would choose the Garand. The Mauser was more precisely made. The German rifle, built to the standards of German engineering, was a more refined mechanism than a Lee-Enfield, and everybody who has handled both knows it. The STG-44, the German assault rifle of 1944, was more advanced than anything the Western Allies fielded, and pointed at the future more accurately than any of them. So what does greatest mean if it does not mean best? It means this. It means a rifle that a country could still build when it was bankrupt, blockaded, bombed, and had just left its army's equipment on a French beach. It means a rifle simple enough that a 19-year-old conscript could be taught to use it well in weeks, and robust enough that he could keep it running in sand at Alamein and in a monsoon in Burma and in Arctic sea ice 70 years later. It means a rifle that could be manufactured simultaneously in England, Canada, the United States, Australia, and India by workforces with no gun-making tradition, many of them women who had never operated a machine tool before 1940, and produce weapons that all pass the same proof. It means a rifle that was there, in enough numbers, in enough hands, on enough continents for long enough. The best weapon in the world is worth nothing if the man who needs it does not have one. The Lee-Enfield's greatness is not that it was superior. It is that it was sufficient and available and reliable. Estimates of how many were built run to well over 10 million. Nobody has an exact figure, because the records of 5 countries across 130 years were never brought together in one place. And that when a 27-year-old with one hand needed something that would work when he braced it against wet earth in the dark, it worked. Somewhere tonight in a locked cabinet in a Canadian Ranger Patrol hut above the Triliche line, or in a police armory in South Asia, or in a museum case in Yorkshire, or in the gun safe of a man in Ohio who bought one at an estate sale 40 years ago and has never quite been able to sell it, there is a number 4 Lee-Enfield. The bolt still times correctly. The bore is still bright, because somebody cleaned it. The proof marks are still legible on the flat of the barrel, stamped there by an inspector whose name is not recorded in a factory that was demolished or converted into apartments, using knowledge that nobody wrote down. It was made by people who are dead now, for men who were mostly not born in Britain, to a set of decisions taken by a Scottish watchmaker's son who never saw a battle in his life. It has outlived its designer, its ballistician, its cartridge, its factory, its empire, and very nearly everyone who ever carried it in anger, and it still works. That is the whole story.